In 1946, Frank Costello received a package at his Manhattan penthouse. Inside was a single black rose and a newspaper clipping about a Chicago businessman who had mysteriously disappeared. Costello immediately called Lucky Luciano in Italy. His voice was shaking. "He knows," Costello whispered into the phone. "Accardo knows about the skim." What they didn't realize was that Tony Accardo had been watching them for months, not through spies or informants, but through a network so sophisticated it made the FBI look like amateurs. The Chicago outfit had developed something the other families never possessed: perfect patience and absolute memory. They remembered every slight, every betrayal, every whispered insult. And Tony Accardo was about to remind the Eastern bosses why Chicago was different. To understand why Lucky Luciano, the man who had restructured the entire American underworld, would cross himself at the mention of Tony Accardo's name, we have to go back to the beginning. We have to understand what made Chicago different from every other criminal organization in America. Most people think Lucky Luciano was the most powerful mobster in American history. After all, he created the Commission, the governing body that brought order to the chaos of the gang wars. He established territories, settled disputes, and turned organized crime into a business. But there was one territory Luciano never tried to claim, one city he never dared to challenge: Chicago. When Luciano was building his empire in the 1930s, he sent emissaries to every major city: Boston, Philadelphia, Detroit, Cleveland. But when his representatives approached the Chicago border, they were met with a simple message: turn around. The messenger who delivered this warning was a quiet man in his 30s named Tony Accardo. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make threats. He simply stated a fact: Chicago belonged to Chicago. What Luciano didn't understand at the time was that he wasn't dealing with just another crime boss. He was dealing with a man who had learned at the feet of Al Capone, but had surpassed his teacher in every way that mattered. Where Capone was flashy, Accardo was invisible. Where Capone sought publicity, Accardo avoided cameras. Where Capone made enemies, Accardo eliminated problems before they became threats. The foundation of Accardo's power wasn't built on violence alone, though he was certainly capable of extreme measures. It was built on something far more sophisticated: information. While other crime families were fighting street wars, the Chicago outfit was building the most comprehensive intelligence network in the criminal underworld. They had judges on their payroll, not just in Chicago, but in Detroit, Milwaukee, and St. Louis. They had police captains who would call ahead before raids. They had prosecutors who would lose evidence and witnesses who would develop sudden amnesia. But most importantly, they had patience. The outfit would wait years, sometimes decades, to collect on a debt or settle a score. This is what Frank Costello discovered in 1946. 3 years earlier, he had skimmed money from a casino operation that had Chicago connections. He thought it was small enough to go unnoticed. He thought enough time had passed for it to be forgotten. He was wrong on both counts. The black rose in the package wasn't just a warning. It was a calling card, a signature that told Costello exactly who was watching him. The newspaper clipping wasn't random either. The businessman who had disappeared was someone who had made the same mistake Costello had made. He had underestimated Tony Accardo's memory. When Lucky Luciano received that panicked phone call from Costello, he knew exactly what it meant. The Chicago outfit had documented everything. They knew about the skim, they knew about the cover-up, and they knew about the lies Costello had told to hide his theft. But more than that, they had waited for the perfect moment to reveal their knowledge. Luciano immediately booked passage from Italy to Cuba. He couldn't travel to the United States due to his deportation, but Cuba was close enough for a face-to-face meeting with Accardo's representatives. The meeting took place in a hotel room overlooking Havana Bay. Luciano, the man who had commanded respect from crime bosses across America, sat across from two quiet men from Chicago and waited to learn his fate. The terms were simple. Costello would return the stolen money with interest. He would also provide the Chicago outfit with detailed information about East Coast operations for the next 5 years. In exchange, the newspaper clippings would stop arriving, and Frank Costello would be allowed to continue breathing. But the real message wasn't directed at Costello. It was directed at every crime boss in America. Tony Accardo was demonstrating something that would define the next 3 decades of organized crime. Chicago didn't just react to problems, they anticipated them. They didn't just punish betrayals, they prevented them. The incident established a pattern that would repeat itself throughout Accardo's reign. East Coast bosses would test boundaries, thinking they could operate in Chicago's territory or compete with Chicago's interests. Each time, they would receive a gentle reminder of their mistake. Sometimes it was a package with a black rose. Sometimes it was a phone call in the middle of the night. Sometimes associates would simply disappear. Meyer Lansky learned this lesson in 1952 when he tried to establish gambling operations in Las Vegas without clearing them through Chicago first. Lansky, perhaps the smartest financial mind in organized crime, thought he could operate independently in the desert. Within a week, 2 of his most trusted lieutenants had vanished from their Miami hotel rooms. No bodies were ever found. No ransom was demanded. The message was clear. Las Vegas belonged to Chicago. The truly terrifying aspect of Tony Accardo's power wasn't the violence itself, but the precision of it. Other crime families would eliminate entire crews when they felt threatened. The Chicago outfit would remove exactly the right person at exactly the right time to send exactly the right message. It was surgical. It was efficient. And it was absolutely terrifying to anyone who understood what they were witnessing. Sam Giancana, who would later become Accardo's successor, once described the outfit's approach to problem solving. "We don't kill people," he said during a recorded conversation. "We solve organizational challenges." This clinical detachment from violence was something that set Chicago apart from every other crime family in America. By the 1950s, the pattern was established. East Coast families would defer to Chicago on major decisions. When disputes arose between different organizations, they would often request mediation from Tony Accardo. He had become not just a crime boss, but the unofficial Supreme Court of the American underworld. The respect wasn't just based on fear, it was based on results. Under Accardo's leadership, the Chicago outfit had achieved something no other crime family had managed: true invisibility. While East Coast bosses were being arrested, prosecuted, and imprisoned, Accardo remained untouchable. He lived in a suburban house, drove ordinary cars, and maintained the appearance of a retired businessman. Lucky Luciano, watching from exile, understood what he was witnessing. Tony Accardo had evolved beyond the traditional model of organized crime. He wasn't just running a criminal organization. He was operating a shadow government. The outfit had judges, prosecutors, police chiefs, and politicians under their influence. They had legitimate businesses generating clean money and illegal operations generating dirty money. Most importantly, they had the discipline to keep both worlds completely separate. This separation is what allowed Accardo to operate for decades without serious legal consequences. While other bosses were bragging about their power and displaying their wealth, Accardo was building systems that would outlast any individual leader. The outfit wasn't just Tony Accardo's organization. It was an institution that would continue operating long after he was gone. The final demonstration of Accardo's superiority came in 1957 at the famous Appalachian meeting. Crime bosses from across America gathered at a private estate in upstate New York to discuss territory and settle disputes. The meeting was raided by state police, creating a public relations disaster for organized crime. Photos of handcuffed crime bosses appeared on front pages across the country. Tony Accardo wasn't at the meeting. He had been invited, of course, but he had declined to attend. According to FBI wiretaps, he told his lieutenants that gathering so many high-profile criminals in one location was amateur hour. While his peers were being photographed and fingerprinted, Accardo was at home in River Forest having dinner with his family. The Appalachian raid marked the beginning of the end for traditional organized crime in America. The publicity led to increased federal attention, which led to prosecutions, which led to informants, which led to the destruction of most crime families. But the Chicago outfit, guided by Tony Accardo's obsession with invisibility, managed to survive and thrive for decades longer than their East Coast counterparts. When Lucky Luciano died in 1962, he was living in exile, his empire dismantled by federal prosecutors and internal warfare. Frank Costello had been forced into retirement after surviving an assassination attempt. Meyer Lansky was spending his final years fighting extradition and tax evasion charges. Tony Accardo, meanwhile, was still living quietly in the suburbs of Chicago. He would continue to lead the outfit, either directly or through hand-picked successors, until his death from natural causes in 1992. He died in his own bed, surrounded by his family, having never spent a single night in prison for a felony conviction. The secret of Tony Accardo's success wasn't just intelligence or ruthlessness, though he possessed both in abundance. It was his understanding that true power comes not from being feared, but from being underestimated. While other crime bosses were fighting for headlines and territory, Accardo was building something far more valuable, a system that could operate indefinitely without drawing attention to itself. This is why Lucky Luciano feared Tony Accardo. It wasn't because Accardo was more violent or more ruthless. It was because Accardo represented evolution. He was what organized crime could become if it abandoned ego and embraced discipline. He was proof that the most dangerous predator isn't the one that roars the loudest, but the one that hunts in absolute silence. The black rose that arrived at Frank Costello's penthouse in 1946 was more than a warning. It was an announcement. It told the entire criminal underworld that the age of flashy gangsters and public spectacles was ending. The future belonged to men who understood that real power operates in shadows, and that the most effective threats are the ones that are never spoken aloud. Tony Accardo had learned this lesson from Al Capone's downfall. Capone had been destroyed by his need for recognition and respect. Accardo would spend the rest of his life ensuring that mistake was never repeated. He built an organization that was more powerful than any individual leader, more sophisticated than any federal investigation, and more patient than any prosecutor could ever be. The outfit's influence extended far beyond Chicago, reaching into Las Vegas, Los Angeles, and even international operations. But unlike other crime families, they never left fingerprints. They never claimed credit. They operated like a force of nature, present everywhere and visible Nowhere. This is the secret that made Tony Accardo the most successful crime boss in American history. He understood that in the criminal underworld, as in legitimate business, the most valuable asset isn't money or territory or even violence. It's information combined with patience. The ability to know everything about your enemies while revealing nothing about yourself. The discipline to wait years for the perfect moment to strike. And the wisdom to strike so precisely that the message is received by everyone who needs to hear it. When federal prosecutors finally began to understand the true scope of the Chicago outfit's operations in the 1980s and 1990s, Tony Accardo was already in his 80s. They had missed their chance to prosecute him during his prime, and by the time they realized what they were dealing with, he had already passed control to the next generation. The outfit that Tony Accardo built outlasted every other major crime family in America. It survived federal investigations, internal wars, and changing times because it was built on principles that transcended any individual leader. It was designed to be invisible, patient, and absolutely ruthless when necessary. Today, when students of organized crime study the rise and fall of American crime families, Tony Accardo's Chicago outfit stands alone. Not because it was the most violent or the most wealthy, but because it understood something that all the others missed. True power doesn't announce itself. It simply exists, quietly and permanently, in the shadows where most people are afraid to look.